Hey everybody, welcome back. We're doing comparative criminology, section 6, where we are going to talk about the pre-trial process. So this is kind of post-arrest, but pre actually getting up in front of a judge and having a trial. So there's lots and lots of stuff that happens between those two things. So let's go ahead and get started. Um, One of the main goals of this whole pretrial process is to act as a filter, right? We want to make sure the cases that should be prosecuted get prosecuted, and then we want to make sure that the cases that shouldn't get prosecuted don't get prosecuted. So the way different countries do that is different. Some people give a lot of discretion to the police and very little to prosecutors, and some to judges. Other countries give lots of discretion to prosecutors and very little to police. Some countries give lots of discretion to both. It really just kind of depends upon a lot of different, again, political and social and historical factors. But all countries have some kind of process to kind of weed out the cases that don't need to move forward at this stage. Just because somebody got arrested doesn't mean they need to be tried or even convicted. Countries have methods of making sure that doesn't happen. Now, there's kind of two philosophical foundations for this pre-trial discretion and whether it should be used and how it should be used and who should use it. So the first is the principle of legality, which essentially says that any case where we have enough evidence to believe a crime occurred needs to be pushed forward. So if somebody's looking at a case and trying to decide whether they should move forward with the prosecution or not, all they should look at is, do we have enough evidence that A, a crime was committed, and B, this is the person that did it. The second one is the principle of opportunity, which essentially says in that case, the person who should use their discretion should look at, does moving this case forward serve the public interest? Is it in the best interests of society, the neighborhood, the community, to move forward with this prosecution and try and get a conviction here? Now, pretrial detention. So this is kind of a weird in between where, in the United States and in many other countries, there's this whole innocent until proven guilty thing. And yet we're detaining people who haven't been convicted of a crime yet, right? They've been arrested. They're put in jail at least for a little bit before they can see a judge. So we're depriving them of their liberty without having a conviction yet. This is kind of a necessary part of this process, but most modern democracies and most modern kind of Western nations, developed nations, they have some kind of process to make sure that this pretrial detention is only used when it's actually needed to be used. Because of that, there's a big reduction in pretrial detention in places like Europe and Africa. Okay, since 2000, the number of people they have had in pretrial detention has shrunk dramatically because crime has shrunk dramatically in those places. Alternatively, in the Americas, Asia, Oceania, pretrial detention has gone up since 2000, despite the giant reduction in crime activity. Now, there's a few different ways, a few different places that we can say, oh, there was either an increase or a reduction in that area for these specific reasons. For instance, in Russia, in 2000, they had 160 per 100,000 people in pretrial detention. That's down to 75 16 years later. So the reason for that was the fall of the Soviet Union, right? The Soviet Union was this huge, giant conglomeration of countries. It collapsed in the early 90s, but it was well known for having lots of people in jails and prisons for lots of different reasons, sometimes for no reason at all. So in 2000, they were still kind of coming down off that process, learning to do new things in different ways. And so they got a lot better when it comes to pretrial detention between 2000 and 2016. I couldn't find any newer data than that. And then the other big one was Rwanda. Rwanda had a 1,300 per 100,000 in the year 2000, and they're down to 31 now. And the reason for that is because of they had a really, really horrible genocide in the mid 90s. And so in 2000, they still had a whole bunch of people that were involved in that genocide in their pretrial detention system. And as those cases work their way through the Rwandan courts, dramatic drop. Now it's down to about 31 per 100,000, which is a much more that number reflects the countries around it much more closely. Now, what are the negatives of pretrial detention? Like we can acknowledge that it's useful or even necessary to have people detained in some or even all cases post-arrest. But what are the downsides? Well, first off, there's mental health impacts, right? Either people with existing mental health issues that are exacerbated by being detained, or people without mental health issues that develop them because of being detained. Then there's the stakes in conformity. So this is one of my one of my favorite areas of study in criminal justice. And stakes in conformity essentially means those parts of your life that make you want to not be convicted of a crime, right? Do you have a good job? Do you have a family that loves you and relies on you? Do you have a dog and a picket fence and all those things that people who aren't criminal see as things they really like about their life that they don't want to lose if they get arrested. Now, pretrial detention can mean, even if you're completely innocent, you lose those things. You can lose your job. You can, family issues, all kinds of things. So if we let people out after, they've been arrested, we're going to try them for something, but we allow them to continue living at home and going to their job and doing the things they would normally do, they can maintain those stakes in conformity up until they are convicted or found not guilty. Disease is rampant in pretrial detention centers. It's bad in prisons. A lot of times it's even worse in pretrial detention just because the facilities aren't as, they don't allow for as much spreading out as they do in many prisons. So we see disease transferred very quickly and easily in pretrial detentions. Traditionally, that's been things like tuberculosis. Obviously, post-2020, COVID is a huge issue in jails and prisons, both pretrial detention and post-conviction detention. Those diseases just spread very quickly among very packed in together groups. And then, of course, one of the biggest problems with pretrial detention is that it can become kind of a de facto sentence, right? You're spending 6 months in pretrial detention and then going on trial for a crime where the maximum sentence is 6 months. Like, you're serving the sentence before you're even convicted of the crime. And that can be a very dangerous thing when that starts becoming normal. Now, one of the worst offenders when it comes to pretrial detention is China. In the second half of the 20th century, even into the 21st century, China has used pretrial detention in a very wanton way. Lots and lots of people get arrested and sit in detention, in jail, waiting for a trial that in many cases just never comes. There's a serious lack of proportionality, i.e., you say something against the government and you get arrested and sit in a pretrial detention for years. for what either shouldn't be a crime or should be a crime, but a crime carrying a penalty of 2 or 3 months, like littering or something. So there's a lack of proportionality in the use of pretrial detention. And then, of course, the most disturbing part of it is there have been lots and lots and lots of Chinese prisoners that have gotten out of prison and reported fairly widespread use of torture, especially with ethnic minorities, because China is a very, very large country and it has lots of different ethnicities and groups of people within that geography, and a lot of them are being kind of specifically targeted, seemingly, by the Chinese government, not just for pretrial detention, but then for torture while in pretrial detention. And there have been studies of, or reports of, prisoners being harvested for organs to donate to other people, kidneys and hearts and such. So very disturbing news, and this is kind of an example of what can happen when pretrial detention is not well controlled. Now, in the Philippines, fairly large island nation off the coast of Asia. In 2018, they looked at, their numbers were studied, and they found that the median stay, so, if you line up all the people in pretrial detention, you look at the person right there in the middle, that person was staying in pretrial detention for 268 days. That's 2/3, 3/4 of a year for a pretrial detention. That's fairly extreme. The mean, i.e., you add them all up, the length of time everybody's in there and divide by the number of people, was 529 days. That's like a year and a half, almost 2 years. So that is a ridiculously high amount of time to be sitting in prison, not convicted of any crime. 20% of those people in pretrial detention are overstaying their possible sentence, i.e., the crime they're accused of has a maximum possible sentence of this amount of time, and they are staying in pretrial detention more than that maximum amount of time. So no matter what, even if they're found guilty, they've already served more than the amount of time they could get for that crime. Now, on the face of it, this is a really sad and problematic issue. On the other hand, this is one of those cases where if you look closer, it's not a good situation, but it is at least a little bit more understandable. And when criminologists looked into this a little bit more, they found that a lot of the time, these delays were not on the part of the government or the prosecution, but on the part of the defense. And one of the common things that these defenses and lawyers and even inmates talked about was that in pretrial detention, you're a lot closer geographically to where you live. So this allows your family to, say, come visit you and bring you, little food and other things that people might want if they were being held in pretrial detention. But then once you're convicted, you go to, essentially there's one big prison that is usually much farther away from where people live, where the prisoners are from, which means they can't be visited by family and friends. They can't have people bring them things. So a lot of times these very long pretrial stays are because we're pretty sure, the defendant is pretty sure they're going to get convicted, and they would rather spend their time close to home in pretrial detention rather than far away from home post-conviction. So again, it's not a great situation. We should definitely work on still bringing these numbers down, but it's at least a little bit more understandable why this kind of thing happens than just looking at the numbers alone would give us. Now, after you're arrested, police are going to interview you. That is a standard policing practice around the world. You get arrested, police are going to put you in a room and talk to you about, tell me what happened, did you do this? Did you do that? Did you see this person? Essentially trying to get more information about the case, more evidence, and ultimately the goal is to get the guilty person to confess to the crime, right? That's kind of the ultimate goal of the police in doing these interviews. And whether someone being interviewed post-arrest, but pre even charging in this case, do they have the right to counsel, i.e. a lawyer? Now, in the U.S., we have a constitutional amendment that says you're essentially always entitled to a lawyer. There are a few exceptions, such as if you're in a lineup, you're not entitled to a lawyer. But essentially, if a police officer is asking you questions and not just kind of using you for things like a lineup, you are entitled to a lawyer to be present. You have to ask for it. So one of the things I always tell my students here in the United States is if the police start asking you questions, say, I would like to speak to a lawyer. I would not like to answer your questions. I would like to speak to a lawyer. There is no downside to talking to a lawyer prior to talking to the police. Now, in other countries, they don't necessarily have that. So for instance, in France and the Netherlands, for those initial interviews that police have with arrested people, suspects, there is no right to counsel. You are not allowed to have a lawyer present with you during that questioning. And the logic there, which is kind of backwards from an American perspective, is that the police need to develop a rapport with the person they're interviewing, i.e. they need to establish a relationship and need to establish kind of a back and forth. In the United States, that's a very kind of very antithetical to how our system was designed and built, and our history and social and community norms. Anyway, I'm going to take a little break, and I will see you for the second half of this section in a bit.